Hello and welcome to the Renaissance. This is session 9 of our Humanities 1 course, and we have now reached the midpoint of the course. Things will begin to move very quickly now. But in the Renaissance, we're going to be looking at some major changes that took place in Western culture. Well, what is Renaissance? Renaissance is a French term meaning rebirth, renaissance. The Renaissance was a period in the 15th centuries and 16th centuries in Europe, which would be the 14 and 1500s, in which there was a renewal or rebirth of art, culture, science, and other things, guided by a return to classical humanism of the ancient Greeks. So when the Crusaders and merchants returned from the Middle East in the late Middle Ages, they had rediscovered some things about the Greeks and the Romans that had been lost to Western civilization. Now, some had remained, but certain things had been lost, but were retained in the East under the Eastern Christians and as well as by the Muslims. And so this humanism, this Greek and Roman humanism, was merged with medieval Christian culture, medieval Catholic culture, to form a whole new way of looking at the world, and that formed the engine for the generation of a vastly richer culture. Artistic themes were a mix of both secular, meaning non-religious, and sacred, meaning Judeo-Christian. What were some of the factors in the rise of the Renaissance? Well, first of all, there was a rediscovery, as I said, in the late Middle Ages, of this classical literature, and especially the works of Aristotle. Aristotle was a philosopher, but really he was what you'd call a polymath, meaning that he was really excellent at many different subjects, art and science and philosophy, just to name a few. He was also a historian, and he was an art critic and so forth. And it also was a rediscovery of the appreciation for the classical art of the Greeks and the Romans. You'll notice that art really changes in this Renaissance period, and it looks a lot more like what the ancient Greeks were doing. There was also a disillusionment with medieval culture. This came about in part because of the disastrous later Crusades. Remember that the first crusade from a European point of view was a great success, but all of the other ones were dismal failures. And because the popes had said that it was God's will and that God was going to give victory, and that didn't really work out, at least in the later ones, many people began to think, well, does the Pope always know what's God's will? Does the Church always represent God's will 100% faithfully? And so there was this questioning that began to come into people's thinking when it came to the Catholic Church. Also, there was skepticism with feudalism, and so people began to say, why does the Lord of the Manor get to run everything? Some people in those days said, I am more educated as a middle-class person than the Lord of the Manor is. I can make better decisions. I have more business sense. I have a better sense of what ought to be happening in society than the Lord of the Manor does. So why does feudalism still rule? Why does the Lord of the Manor still make all the decisions? So there was this skepticism with the system of the late Middle Ages. As I said, there was also a growing freedom to question the authority of the Catholic Church. Catholic Church in the late Middle Ages was the wealthiest institution going in on any level of Western society. And people thought, my goodness, why is the Catholic Church so wealthy? Jesus and the apostles were poor. And how is it that the church is so wealthy? That doesn't seem exactly right. In fact, it says in the Bible that we shouldn't desire great riches in that way. And so people began to question that. There were numerous examples of corruption among bishops and archbishops and popes. And then there was the factor in which Europeans at the end of the Middle Ages had begun to explore the wider world. And with that, they had brought back different ideas, exposure to different cultures, not only with the Muslims in the Middle East and North Africa, but also the Portuguese had begun to explore down the coast of Africa and were on their way around to India, where they would have direct contact with Indian culture and, of course, eventually with China and Japan. So this led to an understanding that, there was a wider world outside European Christian culture. And in some aspects, that wider world had some things to offer. All of these things were factors in the rise of the Renaissance. Let's look at Renaissance Italy. Italy was the beginning place of the Renaissance. And you can see that Italy did not exist as a unified country. In fact, it was not unified until 1871. So really not that many years ago, only 150 years ago or something like that, when it came to the unification of Italy. Before that, it was a number of different smaller, I guess you'd say, city-states or small nations that all shared Italian culture and language. We will find out the same thing is true of Germany, but that's in a later session. So the 5 powerful Italian city-states were Milan, Venice, Florence, the Papal States, and Naples. There were other ones as well, but these are the 5 main ones, the 5 ones that dominated all of the others. And of course, the shining example where the Renaissance actually began was Florence, also known in Italian as Fiorenza. So Florence was the leading city in the early Renaissance. It was ruled by the very powerful Medici family. Cosimo Medici was the patriarch of the family in the late Middle Ages. He was a wealthy banker. In fact, he was the banker for the Vatican. So since the Vatican was the richest institution in Europe at the time, Cosimo was fabulously wealthy as the banker. He took his cut, as bankers do, and he had a lot of money to play with. And so he began to invest that money in the arts and in so many things that would lead up to the Renaissance. His grandson was known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. Lorenzo inherited that fortune from his grandfather, and Lorenzo began to invest in a way that was far beyond what his grandfather had ever dreamed. He wanted to make Florence the wonder of the world in terms of architecture and statues and painted works, all kinds of things. He recruited the best minds, the best artists. He was a patron of the arts, and he was a great humanist, although he was what you would call a Christian humanist. What is humanism? Humanism focuses on human beings as the measure of all things. In the Middle Ages, God was the center. Everything was about God. Everything that we did was with God in mind, and what would God's will be, and what was God's plan. Well, humanism replaced that focus with people. What benefits people the most? So that was a major shift away from that God-centered focus of the Middle Ages. Most Renaissance humanists still believed in the major teachings of the Christian faith. It wasn't that they rejected Christianity. They just shifted the focus from God to people. Modern humanists rarely have a Christian point of view. Modern humanists tend to have rejected the Judeo-Christian worldview, but medieval humanists and Renaissance humanists tended to try to incorporate humanism inside their Christian faith. So Renaissance culture produced wealth, sophistication, and innovation because of this mixing with the other cultures that they had begun to experience as they had explored. Learning in the universities began to openly challenge certain areas of Roman Catholic teaching. As long as it was done on a scholarly university level, you could debate things that the church taught, and you would rarely be punished for that. As long as it was academic debate, the potential of the human mind was also explored. How much could we really know? What are the limits of human knowledge beyond which we could never go? And as I said, art returned to classical styles and forms. Whereas in the Middle Ages, you would never see a nude sculpture, really. Hardly ever would you see such a thing. But the ancient Greeks and Romans had done that, and so in the Renaissance, the nude sculpture returned, and the emphasis was upon the perfect human form. In other words, it wasn't a sexual thing. It was, what does a perfect human body look like? What does a perfect male human body look like? What does a perfect female human body look like? And a lot of the themes in paintings and sculpture were taken from Greek and Roman history, mythology, and legend. So it wasn't just Christian-oriented, as it tended to be in the Middle Ages, but also incorporated some of these Greek and Roman things that had once been lost or at least set aside. Not everybody was excited about the changes. Whenever there's major change, you find people that don't like it. And so some of the reactions were that the Christian leaders believed that this Renaissance culture that was developing was unchristian. because it had gone back to some themes from the Greeks and the Romans and their paganism. Probably the best example of that was the monk Savonarola. He was a powerful preacher. He used to stand up in city squares and preach to hundreds and hundreds of people. He was denouncing Renaissance ideas and corruption in the church. And eventually he got such a following that the Medicis and other leaders who were promoting the Renaissance movement thought that he was a threat, and they had him killed. Supposedly he was killed in a riot, but most historians believe that he was actually put to death by the leaders of the Renaissance because he was causing problems for them and what they wanted to see happen. What are some other reactions? Well, Niccolò Machiavelli was a realist thinker in political science. He was an advisor to several noblemen in these Italian city-states. And as an advisor, he developed a whole theory of political science. And his political science was put into a book called The Prince. Now, the Prince, we think of a prince as the son of a king, but what Machiavelli meant by prince was the ruler of any city, any level, whether they were a duke or whether they were a king or whatever the title was. He called them the prince, the first person, the principate. And in The Prince, he advocated decisive, effective leadership by using certain principles. In The Prince, and it's an interesting read, by the way, you should read it if you get a chance. Machiavelli believed in his writings that rulers should be kind and benevolent when possible. They should be good to people. But when that was not possible to get what was necessary done, they should be cruel. In fact, he believed that you should, if you're going to be cruel, you should be very cruel so that there's no mistaking who's in authority. He also believed that you should be cunning or wise or scheming in dealing with people at all times. In other words, you've got to be one step ahead of people. You've got to be smarter than they are. One of the famous quotes in Machiavelli's The Prince is, "Better a strong ruler, whether good or bad, than a weak ruler who is good." So Machiavelli believed that strong leadership is always better, even if it's from a bad person rather than from a good person. He says good is better, but if you can't have good, then be strong. Others desired to explore the limits of the new freedom in art, literature, and philosophy. Among these were Leonardo da Vinci, perhaps the best known of the Renaissance artists, Michelangelo, Bacon, Copernicus, Shakespeare, and many others. At this time, women were still expected to be in the background culturally. So, although there were important Renaissance women, they tended to be associated with powerful men. They needed to have a man that they stood with. And so, not like our times where women can be powerful and famous and influential in their own right. In this Renaissance time, it was still pretty much a woman needed to be somehow associated with a powerful man. Let's talk about some of these famous Italian artists in the Renaissance. Leonardo da Vinci comes to mind. I've said he is the Renaissance man. He is the best example of the man who can do almost everything. He was a painter, of course, his famous paintings. I think there are only about 12 of them that we still have of Da Vinci's paintings. You'd think you'd have more since he's most famous for his paintings. But the Mona Lisa is one, The Last Supper, featuring Jesus and the apostles, portraying that last meal that they had before Jesus' crucifixion. So only a few of them survive, but he's known for his paintings. He's also known for his sketches, and he had multiple interests and subjects. He was one that would, if a pregnant woman died, he would sometimes purchase the corpse if she wasn't somebody important that the family wanted to bury. If she was, say, a poor woman, he would purchase the corpse and then cut her open to see what it was like for the child in the womb, to understand what that was like in there. He drew pictures of the human anatomy. He was incredibly scientific in his studies of not only anatomy, but physics. He seems to have tried to invent flying machines, military things like tanks, although the propulsion system was a problem, but he seemed to pretty well figure out how the rest of it could work. And underneath all of what he did was mathematics. He's famously quoted as saying, if you don't understand mathematics, don't even bother to look at my art, because my art is all based upon mathematics. He believed that the ideal human body was in mathematical proportion to itself. He was much like the ancient Greeks in that respect. Another great Italian Renaissance artist was Michelangelo Buonarroti. He was a sculptor, and his sculpture featured moving realism. For example, in that Pietà, as you see in the picture here. The Pietà in Italian means pity. Well, who are you pitying there? You see the Virgin Mary holding the body of the crucified Jesus Christ, her son. Now, notice something interesting. It's very, very realistic. And you know it's made out of marble, but it's so realistic that you almost feel like you could reach out your hand and touch the leg of Jesus and feel the flesh. If you touched Mary's hand, you could feel the warmth. You almost feel that way. But there's something interesting there. Who's the larger figure in this sculpture? Now, normally, mothers are not as large as their adult sons. Normally. And here you have Mary at least as large, if not larger, than her son Jesus. So who's the focus here? The focus is not Jesus. It is Mary. That is who you are supposed to pity. Jesus is dead, and here's his mother holding his body. It's supposed to make you look at that and tear up because you feel so bad for her, as you would for any mother who was in that situation. Michelangelo was also a painter. He's famous for the panels on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel that oftentimes are telling stories from the Bible, or at least from early Christian history, or featuring Christian rulers. And so, again, we talked about this when we studied the Judeo-Christian heritage part of Western civilization. A lot of the artwork, you have to understand Judeo-Christianity. You have to understand the Bible to understand the art. And then he was also an architect, and he was the finishing architect for St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, which is the home church of the Pope and of the Catholic Church itself. The building had kind of bogged down, and Michelangelo was actually removed from the oversight of the Sistine Chapel, which he was very upset about, and brought in as the architect, the finishing architect for St. Peter's Cathedral. A couple of other Renaissance artists are Raphael Sanzio. He was a painter of popes and kings, and you can see a portrait of one of the popes in that picture. Also Tiziano Vecellai, artists know him as Titian. He was maybe the greatest of the Italian Renaissance portrait painters, and he painted the portraits of many wealthy and influential people. Another great Italian Renaissance artist is Sandro Botticelli, who featured not so much Christian themes and not so much portraits as he celebrated the mythology of ancient pagans. And here you see a picture of a scene from ancient pagan mythology in which the fauns are playing a trick on the sleeping hero there. And then you see over to the right his own self-portrait. So he was interested in leaving a record of what he looked like. What we call the High Renaissance took place about 100 years into the process. So the Renaissance began around the year 1400, and it reached its peak around the year 1500. Its emphases in terms of portrayal and technique were idealism. This is Italian Renaissance, the peak of the Renaissance in Italy. They tended to paint idealistically, which means that they painted people as they ought to be. So if you had a blemish on your face, that would not be painted in. They would remove that in the painting. If you didn't look your best, they would clean up the painting by making it look more like you should look. So idealism, they would paint you in a scene that maybe you never were in that scene, but they thought it would make you look better or more heroic or grander or something, and so they would put you, they'd paint the scene behind you to make you appear greater than maybe you would have appeared in their studio. Themes stressed depth of meaning. They wanted to paint great important ideas and great people doing great things, great deeds. Color schemes tended to be subdued colors. You see in that picture of that Pope there, Pope Julius II, who dragged Michelangelo off the project at the Sistine Chapel and made him architect at St. Peter's, which Michelangelo resented. You can see Pope Julius there. He has colors. He has a red cape on and a green background, but the colors are not really bright. They don't jump out at you. And so the high Italian Renaissance featured subdued colors and, of course, glorification of the Catholic Church. However, the Renaissance in Italy inevitably bled over into other European nations, notably into Northern Europe, such as in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands, which we call Holland, and in England. And the Northern Renaissance was actually significantly different than the Italian Renaissance. Instead of idealism, they liked to portray things in a realism style, meaning that if you had a blemish on your face, that was painted in, or a mole, it was painted in. If you didn't look your best, if you had aged, well, they painted you as you looked that day. You'll see that realism and idealism play a major role together in the next period, the Baroque. But the Northern Renaissance featured realism. They liked to have clarity of image, meaning that things were clear, that it wasn't fuzzed, or there was no transitional colors, as you see there in the Mona Lisa. She's clear there up in the upper left-hand corner, but there's a lot of fading in the background. The Northern Renaissance liked clarity of image, and they liked their bright colors. Here's an example of Northern Renaissance art. This is Jan van Eyck. He is what we would call, I think we would call him Dutch, but really he's Flemish. The Flemish were the southernmost group among the Dutch-speaking people. They today would live in northern Belgium. And you can see that the colors are a little brighter there. The images are a little clearer. And on the left is the Knights of Christ from the Ghent altarpiece, and another piece is the Annunciation. The Annunciation would be that time in the Bible where the angel Gabriel appears to the Virgin Mary and announces that she's going to be with child and give birth to the Son of God, Jesus. Here's Matthias Grunewald. He's a German painter. This is a portion of the Eisenheim altarpiece. An altarpiece is that wooden grouping of pictures that would be behind the altar in a Catholic church. And so sometimes instead of stained glass, you'd have these altarpieces that would depict scenes from the Bible, biblical figures, and so on. And so here you see, again, the colors are brighter, the images are clearer, more distinct. And that's a good example of Northern Renaissance art. Here's another example. Pieter Bregel the Elder was a Flemish painter, also like Van Eyck. And here you see a portrait of himself in the top right corner. And a couple of his paintings, which are really peasant scenes, people ice skating on a river in a winter landscape, which would be very typical of that time in the 1500s in Northern Europe, especially in Belgium or the Netherlands. And then a peasant wedding. You could see what people dressed like in that period. So this would be even after the medieval period, just at the beginning of the Renaissance, what peasant people dressed like, what they ate at weddings, how they would gather at weddings for a wedding dinner, wedding supper. And so that would be very, very typical. And you can see that he was very interested in painting realistic scenes from people's lives. Here's a German painter, Albrecht Durer, also realism. He had his self-portrait there at the bottom right, and he seems to have thought quite a bit of himself. He painted himself very naturally, very realistically. There's a young hare or rabbit at the lower left, and then probably the most iconic thing that you might find in Lutheran homes would be this painting, or actually drawing, of what they call the praying hands. Very, very Lutheran type of artwork. Whereas Roman Catholic homes might have a crucifix, Lutheran homes would have the praying hands in them. Oftentimes they'd even be published as woodcuts, or in other words, how they would be printed on paper with a wood stamp. So this was Durer, and very, very German, very, very Northern European, and very realistic. Desiderius Erasmus was a Dutch priest, lived from 1466 to 1536. He remained a loyal Catholic all of his life, but he was a critic of various Catholic policies and practices. He raised key questions in his writings which would form some of the springboard or some of the impetus for the later Protestant Reformation. So he did live during the very beginning of the Protestant Reformation, was quoted and used as inspiration by Martin Luther and others who started the Protestant movement, though he himself was never a Protestant. He just said the Catholic Church had some things that it needed to correct, and the Protestants said, yes, and we're going to do it. His focus was for Roman Catholic reform and return to what he called gospel simplicity, meaning that he believed the Catholic Church was way too wealthy, way too complex in its organization, too much structure, too much distance between clergy and people, and that he felt they ought to get back to what Jesus and the apostles were doing in terms of being very close to the people, not being concerned about wealth or prestige. And although he was not liked by some of the Catholic hierarchy, he was never in serious trouble, and so he was able to continue his writings. He's also known for reassembling the Greek New Testament. Up to that point, scholars were using the Latin translation of the Greek New Testament. The New Testament was originally written in Koine Greek, common Greek of the first century, and then the church had used a Latin translation of that called the Vulgate. But Erasmus was able to pull ancient documents together and reconstruct or put back together again the original Greek, or close to the original Greek, of the New Testament. So he accomplished quite a few things that were necessary for the Protestant Reformation, although that was not his aim. Other figures in the Northern Renaissance would include the famous William Shakespeare, who really lives at the very end of the Renaissance, kind of beginning of the Baroque, but we're going to include him here in the Renaissance. He's known as a dramatist or a playwright, and he's from England. He wrote at least 37 or 38 plays and 154 sonnets, which are love poems. He worked in theater design, and he even owned something called the Globe Theater. You can visit a reproduction of that if you visit London and go on the south side of the Thames River where the Globe used to stand. Very famous as not only writing his own plays, but fixing other people's plays at the time, plays that they couldn't work out a good ending or they needed a more dramatic scene. He probably also participated in that. Besides his plays, one of his greatest contributions to Western civilization is words and phrases that are still used in the English language. Now, he invented some of these words, or at least he was the first one to put them in print. So the earliest we can trace them back in print is in Shakespeare's plays. So, for example, the word admirable, lonely, belongings, dawn, dwindle, ill-used, like a person feels cheated or treated unfairly. They're ill-used. Skim milk or watchdog. Also phrases like laughing stock. Somebody is in a pickle. In other words, they're in trouble that they got themselves into. A pound of flesh. You want your pound of flesh. In other words, you want punishment for somebody. You want their pound of flesh. It's Greek to me, meaning I understand nothing of what you just said. Too much of a good thing. Somebody's in trouble because they had too much of a good thing. Somebody wears their heart on their sleeve, meaning you know exactly what they're feeling by the look on their face. We went on a wild goose chase, meaning that we exerted a lot of activity and accomplished nothing. And then famously from, I believe it's Hamlet, what's done is done. And we say some of these things all the time. How about Nicholas Copernicus? He was Polish. He was a scientist, and specifically he was an astronomer. He lived right in the middle of the Renaissance. He set new paradigms in astronomy, including the revolutionary theory at the time of what you call heliocentrism, meaning that it's the sun that's the center of the solar system and not the Earth. In other words, Earth and other planets revolve around the sun and the stars and the planets do not revolve around the Earth. A century later, Galileo, the Italian, would expand on his theories and prove them mathematically. And then Sir Francis Bacon was English. He was the father of really modern science in many ways. He's been described as the first modern scientist. He standardized the inductive procedure for investigating natural phenomenon, sort of the experimental method. And, of course, his work caused a shift in the theoretical framework for scientific pursuits. This is going to be expanded upon later by others, but Bacon was perhaps the first in his line. Okay, that's as much as we're going to cover here in the Renaissance. So we will look forward to continuing a feature of the Northern Renaissance in the next session, and that will be the Protestant Reformation, because out of what Erasmus came up with, out of his ideas and his criticism, as well as the disillusionment with the Catholic Church and the feudal system, will spring the Protestant Reformation. And we'll talk about that next time.